Good We're learning as the Schosser for Shleim Filan Chaya Baserach. On Daf Hey Amid Beis. I really stopped a little bit toward the end of the sugya, but it's no real harm done. We're talking about, we said already two different shitas about a Minchas Ha'omer. We said the first shita that since a Minchas Ha'omer is coming to be matir the Chadash, so therefore Shalai Lishma parcels it altogether. If it doesn't perform its function, then it's no good at all. Then we said Rish Lakish shita that it's going to be kosher, but the shirayim are not allowed to be eaten because the shirayim are really still chadash. So if you do shalai lishma, we respect the shalai lishma enough that you can't. It's not going to make the shirayim nechal until you bring a second omer. Finally, we're up to the third shita. So this is Virava Amar, about 12 lines down from the top on Hey Base. Virava Amar minchas omer shekimsa shalai lishma kshera v'shira nechalin. He is the most makel. He says this minchas omer is kosher, and you could immediately eat the leftovers. It's not possible. You don't need to bring the second minchas omer, like Rish Lakish has said. He says this is a general rule that's going to be relevant over here as well. He says three things. First of all, a machshava is not going to affect Misha Roy Lavoida, Ubedavar Haroy Lavoida, Bamakam Haroy Lavoida. A machshava, a puzzle of machshava, like a machshava's pigel normally is the classic machshava's psul, is not going to make a pu'ula, not make a chalois. It won't be moil, it won't be effective unless it has these three things. It has to be roy lavoida, davar haroy lavoida, makam haroy lavoida. What does that mean? So Gemara, b'misha roy lavoida, afuke kayin balmum. If a kayin who's a balmum does an avoida, let's say he does the hilacha of a carbon, and while he's doing it, he has a machsheves pigel. It's not that we're going to disregard. It's not going to become pigel. Someone who eats that basar from that carbon is not going to be chayiv karas because the pigel doesn't take effect. Since he was a balmum, when he was a kayin doing the avodah, his avodah was meaningless, and therefore the machshav is not going to be effective. The second thing of davar haroy lavodah lafuka mengazaymer. That comes to exclude if someone has a machsheves, for example, pigel, or like we said, a machsheves shaloi lishma, and a minchas omer, it's not going to passel it. Since a minchas omer is coming from barley, Rashi says, and barley is normally not what you bring a mincha from. A mincha is normally brought from wheat. So since it's not a davar haroy lavoida, the machshava doesn't passel, and that's going to be the explanation of Rava. That's why Rava said by minchas omer, if you do it shaloi lishma, the shaloi lishma is not going to have any effect since it's something that comes from barley, which is not normally what you use to bring a mincha. There's no machshavas psul. So we're saying it. Rav is saying it legabe shaloi lishma. It would also mean legabe pigel. If someone has a machshavas pigel while he's bringing the minchas omer, it's not going to passel. It's not going to become pigel.
What type of mincha is it if it's from barley?
Well, it's a minchas omer. I mean, that's the rule. The din of a minchas omer is that it should be brought from barley. But since it's an extraordinary mincha, it's different than almost all the other. There is one other mincha that's also brought from barley, but so Rashi explains. I think it's the maybe the minchas kanois. Rashi's mechalik between them. But generally, all minchas are brought from flour. So since this one is extraordinary, it's unique. It also excludes it from the din of machshavas pasalin. And finally, so that's the answer. That's the part that's relevant to us. And the last part of this, ubedavar haroy. I'm sorry, ubemakam haroy lavoida. It has to be a makam haroy lavoida lafuke nifkam hamizbeach. That's coming to exclude if the mizbeach had a pagam in it. There was some flaw in the mizbeach. So when you do an avoida, this is a Gemara in Zvachim, which we had, that while the mizbeach is nifkam, if someone does an avoida shaloi lishma, it's not going to be not shaloi lishma. Let's say he does it with the machshavas chutz zman, it's not going to be pigel. we're going to say since the mizbeach was pogum, this wasn't a matzef of a carbon of a good carbon, and like we know, in order for a machshava to be effective, there has to be generally a good situation of a carbon. This nifkam, if the mizbeach is nifkam, it's not going to the machshavas pigel is not going to take effect to pasel. Okay, so that's the end of Rav. The Gemara continues, which is not directly relevant to what we said before, but later on it will tie into what we said on the previous block. Tana Rabban, Kshu Omer min habakar lamata. The Torah says, Dabra b'nei Yisrael v'amata aleim adam ki yakum ichem karban l'Hashem min habahema min habakar min hatzayin takrivu es karbanchem. Torah says three lashonos of min, and then it says again one last time im oil karbanoi min habakar. What do we learn from this last thing that says min habaka? She'ein taben loima el lohoitzi yasa treifa. It's coming to tell you that if you do an avoida, if you bring a carbon to treifa, it's going to be possible. Frak the Gemara, and this is going to be a question that's going to need. It's going to take us pretty much a long time to answer this question, and come up with many answers to this question. Frak the Gemara, what do I need a pasuk to tell me that a kutvach? We just started by the two dots on Hayamid base, right in the middle. Why do we need a pasuk to tell me that you can't bring a treifa as a carbon? If a balmum, we know you can't bring a animal that's a balmum as a carbon. And a balmum you could shech, right? You could eat a burger made out of a balmum. It doesn't make it's not the same thing as a treifa. Balmum is a mum, but it's not going to kill the animal. Doesn't make it at all non-kosher. And even so, you can't bring it as a carbon. Certainly a treifa, which is also for a person to eat, but without not in the context of a carbon. Certainly you can't bring it as a carbon, right? Everything there's a higher standard for carbonis. So if a balmum is not allowed, certainly a treifa should not be allowed. So what are the Gemara is asking? What do you need this pasuk for? So the Gemara, this is still the Brisa. The Brisa says, "I'll tell you why we need a pasuk." Chaylev v'dam yechichu. It's not necessarily true that everything that's aser lehedjit is going to also be aser legvaya, because they have chaylev and dam. Chaylev gets burnt as part of the imurim on the mizbeach, and dam gets thrown on the mizbeach. Shasur lehedjit, the person they both treif, you're not allowed to eat them. Mutar legvaya, and they're part of the avodah. So you see that just because something is aser lehedjit, something is mutar lehedjit, it's not going to always be that something that is aser lehedjit is going to be aser legvaya. Because we see chaylev and dam are aser lehedjit and they're mutar legvaya. So no, you can't ask from chaylev and dam. Al chaylev dam shechem boi mechlal heter. These are things. Chaylev and dam are parts of a kosher animal. Every kosher animal has chaylev and it has dam, but it's generally a kosher animal. So maybe that's why, even though it's aser the hedjit, it's mutar legvaya. But a treifa that's entirely aser. Certainly, if it's aser entirely aser lehedjit, it should be aser legvaya. It should certainly be aser legvaya from a kal v'chayim from balmo. Okay, so I'll tell you a different chaylev and dam. You had a way to distinguish it, say that can't be the kasha on the kal v'chayim. Malika teiche. Let's prove from malika shekula isa. When someone does malika on an animal, not in the context of kachim, it makes the animal non-kosher. Malika is not a kosher shechita. You have to do a shechita with a knife. So it makes the whole animal kosher. V'asur lehedjit, and malika is aser to a hedjit, umutaras legvaya, and it's mutter when you do it in the context of a carbon. When you bring a oif, you do malika on it in the Beis Hamikdash. It's like the Gemara, no, you can't even you can't ask a kasha on this kal v'chayim from malika. Ma malika shein kedushasa oisrasa. He says that malika is different. That what is it that makes it the thing that's making the animal kosher? You have to do malika. Malika is what is koshering the animal, is koshering the bird. So that's So that's the reason why Malika could be mutter legvaya, even though it's also to a hedget. But maybe treifa, which is not, you're not accomplishing anything but when an animal is treifa. Maybe on that you should be able to make a kal v'chaimer from Balmum that it should certainly be aser if it's aser lahedget. It doesn't apply by a treifa. The Brisa continues. Okay, so so again, the Brisa said, we learn from a pasuk that treifa cannot be brought as a carbon. The Brisa asked, why don't we learn from Balmum? And the Brisa said, we have Brisa try to bring two rayas, that two kashas on the Kal V'chaimer from Balmum to answer up why we needed a pasuk, and we had kashas on both of those rayas, both of those terutzim of why it wasn't a good Kal V'chaimer, so we're left with still the Kal V'chaimer. So we still have a kasha. Why don't you learn it out from Balmum? And now the Brisa continues, Shafta, and if you'll have a kasha on this Kal V'chaimer from Mum, we'll still have the pasuk to teach you that treifa can't be brought as a carbon. So this is obviously a very strange thing. We said you need a pasuk. Then we ask that let's learn it out from a kal v'chaimer. We try to bring rayas about why the kal v'chaimer is not a good raya, but both of those were rejected. So we still have the kal v'chaimer, and then the Brisa ends off and says, but if you have a teretz on this kal v'chaimer, we still have the pasuk. So that's what the Gemara asks. Ma'am Heshafta. What is this question that we would have on the Kal V'chaimer from Balmum that makes it that we need a pasuk to tell you that treifa is also for a cup? Amara mishum minchas because I could have learned, I could ask from why you can't learn treifa from Balmum, because we have the example of a minchas aimer. Shasur lahedget, the chadash is also to be eaten by anyone, right? Well, before the minchas aimer is brought, chadash is aser, umutaras legvaya, and yet you could still bring the minchas aimer, which is made out of chadash, and bring it on the mizbeach. Like the Mara, malam minchas aimer shechem materas chadash. What kind of question is that? The whole minchas aimer is there to be mater chadash. That's its purpose. So you're saying that we see that the minchas aimer is brought even though chadash is aser, but that's its purpose. Its whole purpose of the minchas aimer is to be mater chadash. So the Gemara b'shvius. No, there are occasions in which you could bring the minchas aimer and it's not being mater chadash. When it's brought in shmita, the chadash, whatever is planted, you're not allowed to plant grain. Essentially, you're not allowed to plow and cause grain to grow. So there is no chadash that the minchas aimer is being matter, and even so, you still bring the minchas aimer in the year of Shemitah. So the Gemara Shvius Nami Shechem Materes Svichen B'Shvius, because the Gemara says, but it's still going to be matter, because although one is not allowed to cultivate crops during Shemitah, but if you have Svichen, if you have naturally growing plants that they grow just from what was left over from the previous year's crop that you didn't plant, you weren't zereyet, but it grew by itself, that can be eaten from the chodesh after the minchas aimer. So maybe that's the reason why minchas aimer can be brought even though it's aser, because it's being mater some of the chodesh, the svichen. It's like the Mara, no, Karabei Kiva. We would need the reason why we can't learn out from minchas aimer, because we're going like Rabbi Kiva, the Amar Svichen Asurim B'Shvius. He holds even the Svichen, even what grows naturally from the previous year's crop, is also Asur on Shvius. So then again, this minchas aimer is not being matter or anything, so that should be a raya keneged a balmum, that either you bring a minchas aimer in spite of the fact that it's not being matter anything. Amli Rav Achabar Abba Ravashi Rav Kiva Nami Lifrach. He says even according to Rabbi Kiva, you could ask a kasha that you can't learn out a treifa from minchas aimer. Mala minchas aimer, you can't. We had said let's learn out treifa from balmum. So we said because we never find such a thing that something is aser to a lehedget and mutar l'gvaya. We said so. According to Rabbi Kiva, l'chayra, even according to Rabbi Kiva, even on Shvi, you're never going to have even the minchas ha'omer is going to be it's going to be aser to everyone. Even the svichina, it's not going to be matter. So there's no way to distinguish to say why minchas ha'omer is mutter. It must be that anything that's even things that are not being matter are still mutter to be brought. So that's the reason why we can't learn out from a Balmo. It's like the Mara Mala Minchas ha'omer shchem materes chodesh b'chutz la'aretz. Even according to Rabbi Akiva, this Minchas ha'omer still is being effective to be matter something, and therefore it's not the same thing as a treifa, because it's being matter chodesh in chutz la'aretz. In chutz la'aretz, they're allowed to. There's no shmita doesn't apply, so you need to be matter the chodesh. And even according to the Mandam who says that it's not being matter, you can't say that during Shavias, according to Rabbi Kiva, you need the heter of the Minchas ha'omer to be mater chadash because b'chutz la'aretz, because there's no iser chadash in chutz la'aretz to begin with. Zok the Gemara, you can still ask a kasha. Shechem ba lahater lav shebesoicha, because the Minchas ha'omer is the Menachos Omer itself is made from flour. So it's coming to be matter that the Kohanim should be allowed to eat the flour of that mincha, the Menachos Omer itself. That comes from Chadash, and that you're allowed to according to Taisus, it's going to be matter it's going to be matter not just from the Isser of Chadash, it's also going to be matter if it happens to be Shvius, it's going to be mutter. Says if this is the case, why don't we learn out treifa from Minchas ha'omer? Why don't we say that when someone brings a treifa as a carbon, if not for that pasuk, let's say that taka, you could bring a treifa as a carbon, and not only will it be a kosher carbon, you'll be allowed to eat it. You could even eat the treifa. So Gemara,
The Kohanim?
yeah, the Kohanim who are eating the whoever it is, whether if it's a shlamim, it will be the bailim, if it will be the achatas, or it will be or asham, it will be the Kohanim. Ella parachachi. Mala minchas ha'omer shechem mitzvasa bekach. The Gemara comes to the final reason why we can't learn out from Minchas ha'omer, that you want to say you can't learn out from treifa because of Minchas ha'omer. You can't learn out from Minchas ha'omer. Minchas ha'omer is different because that is the mitzvah of Minchas ha'omer, that should be brought from something that is chadash. That's what the Torah is requiring you to do, and this is going to be the teretz on the next list of things that we're all going to bring to try to make a pircha to show where we see that something is aser can be brought as a carbon, and like we're saying over here, if it's something that's the mitzvah, that's the way the Torah tells you to do it. How could you compare that to treifa? Treifa, there's no mitzvah to being a treifa; just happens to be a treifa. Rish Lakish Amar, he tries to bring a different thing. We're going off of Minchas ha'omer. Rish Lakish tries to bring a different pircha, right? We're still trying to understand. At the end of the brayso, we said, what is the tshuva on the kal v'chaimer that we wanted to say? Let's learn treifa from Balmum. If a Balmum can't be brought as a carbon, certainly a treifa, which is also to be eaten, is also to be brought as a carbon. So what's the kash on that? On the kal v'chaimer, I'll prove it from the one who mixes. From the one who mixes the Ketores. Sha'asa l'hedget u'muta l'gvaya. A hedget can't do it, but l'gvaya can be done by gavaya. The Gemara seems to understand very strangely that when it says mafatim l'gvaya, it means the Rabbeinu Shalom should be the one who has to be mafatim the Ketores. In fact, the Gemara mafatim gavrahu. There's no such thing. There's no mafatim that the Rabbeinu Shalom does the pitum is the one who mixes the ketairis. It's done by a person. Ella, it's like the Gemara, what it really means is what we're familiar with. The the isser of mixing the ketairis. So also lahedjit, it's also to do it for, if you do it for mundane purposes, just to use as a spice, as a perfume in your house, or mutter likvaya, but it's mutter to do it for use in the Beis Hamikdash. So l'chayr we see that something could be also lahedjit and mutter likvaya. So just as we said by the Menachos Aimer, you can't bring me a raya that treifa. You can't be mafrech on the kal v'chayma of treifa from Balmum, because a treifa, there's no mitzvah to bring a treifa. Ma'asha enkin over here, Peter Makteris is supposed to be done lehedjit. That's what you're required to do. Mar brei de Ravina ama mishum dekalamema Shabbos techich. I'll prove it to you from the karbanos that you bring on Shabbos. Right? On Shabbos, you're not allowed to shecht an animal, but you're allowed to bring a carbon. The musafim, the required, the tamid and the musaf are brought on Shabbos, even though you're going to be mechal Shabbos. There's no chilul Shabbos with these karbanos. Shasur lehedjit. You can't shecht an animal for a hedjit on Shabbos, but taras legvaya. You could do it for legvaya, for the carbon. Zaklamar mal Shabbos chein hoteras. The klala etzel hedjit b'mila. The says no, you can't bring a comparison from Shabbos, because Shabbos altogether that we know there's it's more kuladik, because you could do a mila on Shabbos. So just like you could do a mila on Shabbos, maybe that's why you could also bring a carbon on Shabbos, even though it's ba'atzam asa. It's like tomorrow atu milach tzarech hedjidu mila mitzvahu. What do you bring a raya from mila? The fact that you could do a mila on Shabbos proves nothing about the reason why you can do a carbon on Shabbos. That's Mila is a mitzvah. It's not a tzorech hedjit. Elamal Shabbos shem mitzvah sebekach. So the teretz is no. The teretz of Shabbos is, like we said on the previous, like we said by Menachos Aimer, we said by Peter Makteris, you can't bring a raya for treifa from Shabbos, because the mitzvah of Shabbos, you're supposed to bring, the musaf is specifically for Shabbos. That's the time you're supposed to bring it. So there's no raya from the fact that you could bring it on Shabbos, that treifa would be mutter. Ravada barabam mishum de ikalamemer klayim techich. Let's bring a raya from klayim. This is our fourth thing that we're going to bring. Shasur lehadjit umutar legvaya. We're trying again to bring a raya that you can have something that's also lehadjit and mutar legvaya. That is the avnate of the kohen gadol. Rashi explains on the next amud, is made out of a mixture of shatnez, of flax and wool. So the Gemara, Malaklayim shechein hutru miklol neitzel hedjit betzitzis. The Gemara says that's not a raya. You can't bring a raya from Klayim, because Klayim has a different kula, because a person can make his tzitzis, he can make his beged out of what do you call it? Out of flax, and then make the tzitzis hanging off of it out of tzemet. Zak Gemara, again, the same title like we had on Shabbos. Atu tzitzis tzarech hedjitim mitzvahi. That's it's a mitzvah. So we don't see, there's no raya that you find something that's mutar lahedjit and that's also lahedjit and mutar ligvaya, because it's also going to be this heter lahedjit is also only for a mitzvah. Allah malaklayim mitzvah sebekach. Again, the same teretz like we said by all the other ones, that is the mitzvah. You're supposed to wear an avnet made out of a combination of that shatnez. Rav Shishi Baridi Amar Mishum Deikalamem Eli Hadu Dina V'Teisi V'Mehatzad. Rav Shishi Baridi says, okay, right? The Brisa had said, why don't we learn out treifa from Baal Mum? So we wanted to say first, let's learn it out from chaylev and dam that are brought on the mizbeach. That those are things that are also lehedjit and not mutar ligvaya. So we had a kasha on that in the brisa. Then we said let's learn out from lika, and we had a kasha on that. So and then we gave, and then the brisa had said, but if you have a teretz, if you have a tshuva, we have the pasuk. So Rav Shisha Baridi says really that's what the brisa meant. He meant to say the first two things that have been mentioned from the brisa will make a me'atzad from those two kashas. Amar Amar mishum de'ekel ameim lehadu din of a tesi b'ma'atzad. We're bringing from a ma'atzad of the two things that were brought in the brisa. Mala malika shchen kedoshasa israsa. The reason why we couldn't bring a raya from malika is because malika, the malika itself, is what's mekadesh. That's how you were supposed to bring an oif. Chaylev and dam yichichu. The chaylev and dam are not what's mekadesh this kachim. You shecht it the way you shecht a regular animal. Mal chaylev and dam shechein boy mechal heter. And if you'll say, what about the chaylev and dam? That the rest of the animal is kosher lahedget. So that's the reason why it's mutter ligvaya. Malika derchiach. But malika is not something that's coming. If you were to do a malika b'chutz, the entire animal would be puzzle. B'chazar adim l'roi zeh k'roi zeh v'l'roi zeh k'roi zeh hatzara savashman shastrun lahedget mutar and ligvaya. So this should be a kasha. Why you can't learn out treifa from Balmum, because we find that there's such a thing that something could be asul hedjed and mutar ligvaya. So even though a treifa is asul hedjed, maybe it's mutar ligvaya. That's why we need a pasuk to tell you that you can't bring a treifa. Avani yavi treifa avapi shasur lahedjed te mutaris ligvaya. And for the Gemara, malatz al shavash and mitzvah bekach. Again, we have the same teretz that we had on all of the other kashas on the Kal V'chaimer, that we could have that also on this Ma'atzad. Both the Malika, that's the proper way. The Torah requires you to do Malika on an oif, and the Torah also requires you to throw the Chaylev and Dam on the Mizbeach. Ela Amar Ravashi, Mishum de'ekel amem mikara dedina pircha. He says the reason why is because we could say the actual din, that we want to say, let's learn out treifa from Balmum. Just like a Balmum can't be brought on the Mizbeach, a treifa also shouldn't be brought. You have a kash on that. Mehecha kamaisila mi Balmum. You want to bring treifa, learn treifa from Balmum. Mala Balmum shchein asaboy makriven kekreven. Balmum has a unique facet, a unique factor, that both an animal that is a Balmum can't be brought as a carbon, and the kayin who is a Balmum can't bring the carbon. So that's, in spite of the fact that a Balmum is mutter lahedjet, that's why it's asal likvaya, because it has that unique attribute that in addition to the animal being a Balmum passeling, it also will passel a kayin who's doing the hakrava, who's doing the avodah, it's going to passel him, which is not found by a treifa. A kayin who's a treifa can do avodah, it doesn't passel a kayin. Amalei Ravacha Sabal Ravashi. I'll bring you a raya. I'll prove it to you that that's not the reason why. You want to say the mimchalik between a balmum. The truth is, what he's really saying is that there's a second source for this din that a treifa is possible. You can learn it out from a yaitza daifin, an animal that's born from a cesarean. Shaloyasa by makriven kekreven. Again, a kain who is a yaitza daifin is not possible to do the avodah. And nevertheless, you cannot bring a carbon from a yaitza daifin, but a yaitza daifin is mutter to eat. So that will be so we have, in addition to Balmum, we have a second thing that's mutter lahedjet v'asal ligvaya. So let's say that should certainly be able to teach us that a treifa is going to be asal ligvaya. If a yaitza daifin is asal ligvaya, certainly a treifa is. It's like tomorrow, mal yaitza daifin shchein kadosh b'bchayra. I could tell you a difference of a yaitza daifin is that if you have a b'chayr that's born to someone, it still goes to the kayin. It still has a din that it has a din b'chayra that it goes to a kayin. That means even though it's not going to be brought as a carbon by the kayin, but the kayin can eat it. So maybe that's the reason why it's asur ligvaya. Sagt the Gemara, Balmum yachiach. He's saying it's not a bachar. Yeah, right. It doesn't. I'm sorry. So a yaitze daifin does not have a din of a bachar. It's not treated as a bachar, so it's not going to go to the kain. Basha enkein a treifa, that even if it's a treifa, if it's born as a bachar, it goes to the kain. It can't, like I said, what I meant to say is the treifa can't be brought as a carbon, but it will belong to the kohen to be brought that he could eat it. So so it's true you have a kasha of a yotze doifen. That's not kaddish b'chayra, but Baal Chum does become kaddish b'chayra. Mal Baal Mum shchein also by makriv and kekreva. But we had a kasha of we couldn't learn out from Baal Mum to treifa because the people bringing it have the same status that if they're a Baal Mum, they're also going to be pasul. So yotze doifen yechiach. V'chazar adin lo roizeker lo yuzeh lo roizeker roizeh. That's how shabutar and lahedget v'asur l'gvaya. So we should be able to make a matzah from the two of them to teach you treifa. So both Yetzidoif and Baal Mum, there's no heter to be found by them. Treifa, there is a heter that applies to treifa. The Gemara is going to say what is that heter in a minute. What does you mean that you can't learn out from the Ma'atzad, from the Yetzidoif and Baal Mum, because treifa is hutra michlala? What is that hutra michlala? Ilay mamalika da'ila sa'if ligvaya. If you'll say that when you do malika on an oila sa'if, that it can be brought as a carbon in spite of the fact that it already became a treifa, meaning when you do a malika, the first thing you do is you crush the neck, you cut the spine of the animal before you get to the simanim. So prior to cutting the simanim, which is the end of the avodah, it already became a treifa. But nevertheless, the Torah says that it can be brought as a carbon. It doesn't stop you from bringing it as a oila sa'if. So if that's the case, Baal Mum also is mutter legabe oif. There's no mumin, as well as there's no male or female legabe birds. But the point we're trying to say is that there's no mumin legabe and oif. So if you're trying to say that it's chotra mechlaloi legabe treifa, and that's what distinguishes it from Yotze Doifen and Baal Mum, but Baal Mum also there's no mumin by oif. So what is chotra mechlaloi? Ela malika de chatas oif lekehanim. It means the malikas of a chatas oif that makes it into a treifa that can then be eaten by kohanim, as opposed to being burnt on the mizbeach like an oila. So the Gemara, that's not a raya. Kohanim meshulchan gavaya kazachu. That which kohanim eat the animal, that they're allowed to eat they're allowed to eat their portions of a carbon. They're not considered to be something that's mutter lahedjit, because it's really they're really eating mishulchan gavaya. What they're eating is really something that's gavaya. Nevertheless, the Torah said that they can be partake of the Rebbeinu Shalom's chelik. So therefore, there's no difference between treifa and Baal Mum. Just like we're allowing a Baal Mum oif to be eaten in the case of a chatas oif, so we don't have a kasha on the limud from Baal Mum and Yotze Doifen. So again, so what do we need the pasuk for? What do we need the pasuk of Min HaBakar to tell you treifa? We could have learned it from here.
So we're saying that because if malika is done on a chatas oif, the Kohen can eat it, but if it would be malika done on a regular bird, it would be also to eat?
What we're saying is, you want to say that that treifa is hutra michlaloi, that when you do malika of a chatas oif, it can be eaten by kohanim. So that's where it's chutra mechlaloi, that it's not always it's mutter to be consumed. The Gemara is so therefore that you can't learn out from where that was we said that there was a distinction. You can't learn out from Baal Mum together with Yotze Doifen, because treifa has a heter that it's hutra michlale, and therefore it can't be learned out from the two of them. So we wanted to say, so what is the hutra michlale? That even though when you do malika on a chatas oif, it's becoming a treifa before the avodah is completed, it still can be eaten by the Kehanim. The Gemara says that's not a riot anything, because that's not a achila of a hedget. That's mishulchan gavaya. That's what they're eating is really part of what belongs to the Rebbeinu Shalom, and therefore it's it's considered something that's on the mizbeach. So it's the same thing. We just said, right, because we know that balmum of oif can be brought on the mizbeach. So you want to say it's hutra michloloi legabi that the kahanim could eat it? That's the same thing as it being offered on the mizbeach. There's no distinction between them. So how could you say there's a chiddush by treifa that you don't have by a balmum? The balmum, no, they're really the same thing. Balmum could be brought on the mizbeach by a knife, and the oif, the chatas oif, can be eaten by the kahanim, which is equivalent to being eaten by to being burnt on the mizbeach. That's the cheshbon. That's what we're up to. The elapar chachi. So again, we're stuck. Why can't we learn out from Yotze Daifin? This hutra mechlale didn't pan out. So why don't we learn out treifa from a tzara shava of Yotze Daifin together with mum? Elapar chachi outside of a shabbos shechein mumon nicker. Time of treifa shechein ein mumon nicker. Both balmum, you can see the mum, and the Yotze Daifin. Everyone knows when an animal, you can see when it comes out that it was removed from the mother. Mashaken a treifa is internal; you can't see it. Mishum hachi itzrakra. I would say, even though those two things are mutalik vaya, but something that's ein mumonikar would be kosher. Even though those things are asalik vaya, this the treifa would be mutter. Mishum hachi itzrakra. That's all we need the pasuk, because we can't learn it out from the Kal V'Chaima. The Gemara. Okay, so that is the end of our limud. We came to the conclusion of why we need a pasuk to tell you that treifa cannot be brought as a carbon. The Gemara, treifa mehacha nafka, mehasam nafka. We have a different pasuk that tells you that a treifa can't be brought as a carbon. Maski Yisrael, menamoti Yisrael. The Torah says that we on the previous blot, and this is the reason why we said this whole long Gemara is to get to this, that you could only bring as a carbon something that is a viable, which is allowed to be eaten by Yidden. So a treifa is a treif, like we say. So it can't be eaten by Yidden, so therefore it also can't be brought as a carbon. And secondly, Michola sheyavatach as a shevet nafka. Probably treifa she'enai vers. It says legabe ma'isa behema. It's anything that passes underneath the rod, which comes to exclude a treifa. A treifa is not healthy enough to go underneath it. It has to Rashi explains that it means something that is not healthy, that doesn't have, it's not going to live, is not considered to be over tachas hashevet.
This is legabe ma'isa.
Well, we say it that it's legabe that it can't be brought for ma'isa behema. It can't be brought as a ma'isa behema, but then we learn out from there to all other karbanos that are just like this. A treifa can't be brought as ma'isa behema. Also, all karbanos can't be brought as a treifa. So now we have three psukim to tell you the din that a treifa. The first is min habakar, the second is mashka Yisrael, and the third is kol asher yavatach hashevet. So Gemara is asking, what do you need all three? So what trichi? The even mashka Yisrael, if it would just be from the pasuk of mashka Yisrael, it says that anything that is not allowed to be eaten by Yidden can't be brought as a carbon. Havamina lemuta heicha lo heisel shasa kosher dum yida'ar lo klaya kerem. The pasuk of mashka Yisrael, that pasuk also discusses the issur of arla and klaya kerem. So I would think it has to be similar to Arlo Klaya Karim that would never mutter. I will hoisel a kosher emetiskasha. Maybe if it became a treifa after it was born, maybe that should be kosher. That's what we had to say, kosher yaver, that even though it had a shasa kosher, it became a treifa beforehand, it's also to be brought as a carbon. Because of Rachmana kosher yaver, avamina lemute hecha de nitra for l'b'sleif I would say that's coming to exclude who became a treifa before it became kaddish. Dumya de meiser, just like meiser that it's talking about where kalasha yaver had to would say excluding if it became a treifa before it was put on the shevet and became meiser. I will but what about if it was the other way around, that it first became kaddish and then it became a treifa? Maybe then it would be mutter to be brought on the mizbech. When the time that it became kaddish It was still not a treifa. Emet is kasha. Chasar rachmana min habaka. That's what we need. Our pasuk min habacha tzrichi. So that's what we need. All three sukkim. Okay, what time is it? 8:24. Okay, I think we'll stop over here, much to my chagrin, and we will, Bez Hashem, learn tomorrow at 7.